My name is Haley, and 3 years ago, my mother looked me straight in the eye and told me something I've never forgotten. She said my sister earned real money, while I was just playing office. I remember the way her voice didn't even hesitate, like the verdict on my entire life had already been written and sealed. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't explain the certifications I was studying for, the late nights, or the quiet promotions no one in my family bothered to ask about. I simply nodded, set my fork down, and walked out of that dinner. At the time, they thought my silence meant defeat. They had no idea it was the moment I decided I didn't need their applause to build something solid. What they really didn't know was how money actually works, how numbers don't bend for pride, how debt doesn't disappear because someone looks successful online, how a person can earn big one month and drown the next. They didn't know any of it until the day a thick loan file landed on my desk at the bank. A file marked Urgent Review, stamped with a last name I knew too well. That was the day everything flipped. The day the family, success story, needed help from the daughter they said wasn't going anywhere. And the day I realized I would have to choose between doing my job or saving people who never once believed in me. Before I tell you what she said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. 3 years later, my life had settled into a rhythm that finally felt like mine. I lived alone in a quiet part of St. Paul, in an apartment that wasn't fancy but paid for with money I earned without anyone's approval. Most mornings began before sunrise, a routine that suited me more than I expected. The stillness helped me reset before stepping into a job that demanded clarity and precision. By then, I had worked my way up to senior credit underwriter at a regional bank. It wasn't flashy, but it was a position built on skill, not showmanship. My workday revolved around assessing risk, understanding patterns, and making decisions that shaped people's financial futures. There was no applause, no spotlight, no one proclaiming that I earned real money, yet the weight of responsibility was unmistakable. The more complex the file, the more it seemed to land on my desk, and I learned to embrace the quiet power that came with that. My office was a small corner room on the fourth floor, nothing dramatic, yet it represented every long night and every certification I'd pushed through when no one was watching. I liked it there. It felt steady, predictable, and free of the comparisons that had once defined my place in the world. People respected me for my judgment, not for the illusion of success. My closest colleague, Jordan, worked across the hall. Sharp, organized, and genuinely easy to trust, Jordan often handled the preliminary review on cases before forwarding them to the senior team. We didn't talk about personal lives much, which suited me. Professional boundaries were cleaner. Still, there was a quiet understanding between us, the kind that develops when you shoulder the same pressure every week. Above us was Higgins, our department head. He wasn't warm, but he was fair, and fairness mattered more than friendliness in our line of work. He valued accuracy, discipline, and consistency, traits I had spent years cultivating. His approval wasn't given lightly, and earning it had been one of the hardest steps in my career. Outside the office, I kept my circle small. I spent weekends catching up on reading, walking by the river, or cooking simple meals. I didn't go home much anymore, not because I was angry, anger fades, but because distance can be a kind of peace. I learned to stop seeking validation in places that had none to offer. Silence became easier to live with than the weight of being underestimated. Financially, I was stable, not extravagant, not struggling, just steady. My credit was clean, my savings grew little by little, and my choices were measured. That steadiness, that quiet certainty, meant more to me than any dramatic rise or fall. In that phase of my life, everything moved with a simplicity I had never experienced growing up. Success was no longer a performance. It was a quiet accumulation of competence, a life built on small, disciplined steps rather than impulsive leaps. Most people didn't understand the comfort of that, but I did. And on an ordinary weekday morning, with numbers scattered across my screen and a stack of pending files waiting in the corner, I felt sure of one thing. I had finally stepped into a version of myself no one else had shaped. I had no reason to believe anything unexpected was coming, until it did. The shift in pace came quietly, the way most turning points do. I had just settled into the second half of my morning when Jordan appeared at my door with a stack of files balanced against one arm. There was nothing unusual about that. High-volume review days always brought extra work to the senior team. Jordan set the pile on my desk, sorting out one folder marked with a red sleeve before sliding it toward me. That marker was reserved for applications requiring senior-level scrutiny. Income inconsistencies, unstable payment history, questionable debt ratios. Each case had its own reason. I opened it expecting the typical patterns I had learned to recognize over the years. Instead, the name printed across the first page pulled me into a different reality altogether. Miranda Ray Harper. My sister's full name stared back at me in clean administrative font, aligned neatly with the requested loan amount and her signature. A familiar address sat beneath it, one she had shown proudly on social media. I read every line twice, careful not to let instinct get ahead of analysis. Personal connections didn't change risk, and they certainly didn't rewrite banking rules. A second section listed her outstanding debts, several credit cards carrying high balances, each with interest creeping beyond control. An auto loan, multiple late payments over the past year, a debt-to-income ratio that surpassed acceptable limits long before reaching my desk. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. She was stretched thin. The income report deepened the picture. Her earnings fluctuated sharply, peaking in one season and dipping hard in the next. Real estate had always been volatile, but the gaps between commissions here were unusually wide. A year earlier, she might have qualified. Now, the numbers told a different story. I turned the page and paused at the cosigner section. Denise Harper, my mother, had provided her information, complete with employment details and contact number. There was no hesitation in her handwriting, no sign she understood the financial weight attached to her name. Co-signing wasn't symbolic. It meant shared liability. It meant consequences. It meant exposure to risk she couldn't possibly absorb without impact. I kept reading. The application included statements from the brokerage Miranda worked with, records of her last several closings, and projected earnings she claimed she could meet by the end of the year. But projections weren't guarantees, and her documentation leaned more toward optimism than accuracy. Everything in my training urged caution. Numbers, unlike people, didn't flatter or exaggerate. They outlined patterns that revealed decisions, habits, and turning points. Her pattern was unmistakable: decreasing cash flow, inconsistent performance, and accumulating debt. Each factor alone might be manageable. Combined, they formed a risk profile no responsible underwriter could ignore. I made notes in the margin, marking sections that required verification. It wasn't unusual for applicants to overstate income or underestimate expenses. My job, the part no one saw, involved separating hope from reality, then aligning the facts with policy. Emotion didn't weigh into that process, even when the name on the form belonged to someone I had grown up with. By the time I finished the initial review, the path forward was clear. This wasn't just a weak application. It was one that signaled deeper financial strain beneath the surface. And as procedure required, the next step was direct verification with her employer and the listed cosigner. I closed the file gently, letting the weight of it settle before moving it to the verification queue. The work continued, but nothing about this case was routine. The next step unfolded the same way it always did when a file raised too many questions. I moved the folder to my verification queue and began with the employment check, dialing the brokerage number listed on the form. A receptionist transferred me, and after a brief hold, the call connected to Greg Mason, the office manager. I introduced myself only with my role and the purpose of the verification. Greg responded in a tone that carried the exhaustion of someone juggling too many agents at once. When I referenced Miranda's projected income for the coming year, there was a pause, the kind that said more than anything he could have stated outright. His explanation stayed within professional boundaries, yet the substance was unmistakable. Her closings had slowed. Market shifts had hit her harder than most. Commission gaps stretched longer than what she had reported in her application. Whatever she had written as her anticipated earnings didn't match the pattern reflected in their internal statements. I documented his responses carefully, noting the disclaimers and hesitations that indicated instability rather than growth. Verification wasn't about extracting judgments, it was about mapping truth to policy. And the truth suggested her financial momentum was slipping faster than she admitted, even to herself. Once that call ended, I moved to the co-signer verification for Mom. Procedure required it. I dialed her number, expecting a quick confirmation, maybe a surprised comment. Instead, her voice came through bright and sincere, as if nothing about the situation warranted caution. She confirmed her details without a single question about why a bank needed them. I asked the required follow-ups: income, employment, liabilities. And each answer made it clearer she didn't understand what co-signing legally entailed. To her, it was a gesture, a show of support, something symbolic, like vouching for a friend. There was no awareness that her credit profile would be tied to Miranda's loan, or that any missed payment could fall directly onto her shoulders. She didn't ask about repayment terms or responsibility thresholds. She didn't ask about risk at all. What she did volunteer, unprompted, was the same confidence she had always placed in my sister. She spoke as though Miranda's success was unquestionable, as though the numbers could only be interpreted one way, the way that fit the story she believed in. The certainty in her voice formed a contrast so sharp I felt it physically. It reminded me how easily enthusiasm could override reality, and how often pride drowned out practical sense. When the call ended, I sat for a moment with my notes spread before me. Each verification point aligned with policy concerns: income inconsistency, volatile performance, a cosigner unaware of the weight being carried. None of it surprised me, but the clarity was sobering. The file wasn't weak. It was structurally unsound. I entered the final documentation into the system, attaching the verification summaries and the risk assessment they supported. The folder's trajectory was already beginning to take shape. My responsibility wasn't to rewrite facts or soften their implications. It was to evaluate the truth as it stood, regardless of whose name appeared on the form. And with that, the application moved one step closer to its final outcome. The review concluded with a clarity that left no room for alternate interpretations. I gathered the verification summaries, the financial inconsistencies, and the risk notes into one comprehensive report, arranging each section with the precision expected at my level. The process wasn't emotional. It couldn't be. Files didn't receive exceptions because of surnames, and procedures didn't bend for the sake of comfort. Once everything was documented, I walked the report to Higgins for departmental approval. His door was half open, as it usually was, an invitation to step in only when necessary. I placed the folder on his desk, standing silently as he read through the details. His expression didn't shift, but his attention sharpened in the way it always did when evaluating borderline cases. When he reached the final page, he closed the file gently, aligning it with the edge of his desk. The approval came in the form of a simple acknowledgement. The numbers warranted a denial, and the recommendation aligned with policy. Nothing more needed to be said. I took the folder back to my office and began preparing the formal notice. There was a rhythm to it. Entering the determination, uploading the documentation, generating the letter that explained the decision in neutral, compliant language. Each step carried its own weight, yet none allowed for personalization or commentary. The outcome stood on its own. When the denial letter was finalized, it entered the outbound queue for delivery. The system would send a digital copy to the applicant and the cosigner. I logged the final note in the file and moved it to its completed status. A straightforward, procedural conclusion. The call came later that evening while I was preparing dinner. Mom's name flashed across my screen. I hesitated for a moment before answering, knowing her voice would carry the force of her expectations. The first words out of her mouth weren't questions. They were accusations. She spoke with disbelief, as though the decision reflected personal animosity rather than objective assessment. There was frustration layered in every sentence, a certainty that I could have altered the outcome if I truly wanted to. I let her finish before responding. My explanation stayed within the boundaries of what ethics allowed. I told her the truth, that I had followed procedure, that risk guidelines determined the decision, and that personal involvement didn't grant authority to override policy. There was no dramatic speech, no plea for understanding, just the plain, steady clarification of my responsibilities. Her disappointment hit with a weight that felt familiar, but I refused to absorb it the way I once would have. My role wasn't to rescue anyone from consequences or rewrite reality to match their expectations. It was to assess applications according to the standards I was hired to uphold. When the call ended, the silence felt sharper than usual. Yet beneath it, there was a calmness rooted in certainty. I had done my job, not as a daughter, not as a sibling, but as a professional. And in that distinction, I felt a clarity I hadn't known I needed. The next few days unfolded with an uneasy quiet that didn't last. Early that week, the system confirmed delivery of the denial notice, and I knew exactly when Miranda received it. My phone stayed silent, but the sudden surge of missed calls on the family group chat told its own story. She reached out repeatedly, switching between brief messages and long, frantic ones that grew more scattered as the day progressed. I didn't open any of them. At work, my routine continued without deviation. Reports, reviews, meetings. Nothing paused for personal turmoil. Yet beneath the steady pace, I sensed the shift. Mom left several voicemails, each one more urgent than the last, though I chose not to listen beyond the first few seconds. There was nothing productive in hearing her disbelief or her frustration. I had already provided the explanation she asked for. Repeating it wouldn't change the situation. By midweek, the consequences of the denial became clearer. The application had been central to a financial plan Miranda had structured around assumptions rather than realities. Without the consolidation, her existing debts remained untouched, and the obligations she had postponed resurfaced with increasing pressure. The lifestyle she had built, the one that required constant momentum, began to lose its balance. Payments she once managed by stretching each month now stood in full view, demanding attention she could no longer redirect. I learned most of this indirectly, through small signs that filtered back to me. A mutual acquaintance mentioned she had taken unexpected time off work. A neighbor told my mother he had seen unfamiliar cars at her doorstep, the kind associated with overdue balances rather than social visits. Little pieces of information that pointed toward a picture she could no longer disguise. Despite the growing pressure from home, I stayed focused on my responsibilities. The separation between personal and professional roles had taken me years to form, and I wasn't going to dismantle it out of guilt or nostalgia. When Mom visited my place unannounced one evening, I chose not to open the door. Her presence in the hallway lingered for several minutes. Footsteps shifting, a soft knock, the quiet sigh she made when she eventually walked away. The weight of her disappointment pressed faintly against my chest. but I didn't break the boundary I had set. As the week progressed, Miranda's attempts to reach me dwindled. The expectation that I would step in had always been implicit, a quiet assumption that my stability existed to cushion her missteps. When that assumption collapsed, she was forced to confront the reality she had postponed for years. I didn't witness her reaction directly, but I could imagine the shift from disbelief to anger, from anger to fear, and from fear to resignation. The pattern was familiar. I had watched her cycle through it before whenever consequences caught up to her, though never at this scale. I maintained my distance, not out of cruelty, but necessity. Helping her now would reinforce the same dynamic that had defined our family for too long. She had been protected from consequences while I had been expected to absorb them. This time, the structure reversed. She stood at the edge of a financial reckoning, and I remained exactly where I needed to be: steady, silent, and uninvolved. By the time Friday arrived, the situation around her had grown increasingly unstable. I sensed she would reach a breaking point soon, though I didn't know what form it would take. What I did know was that, for the first time, I felt no obligation to soften the impact. By the time early spring arrived, the shift in my family dynamic had settled into something permanent. There were no dramatic confrontations, no emotional implosions, only a gradual, inevitable unraveling that revealed just how thin the threads had always been. The distance did not feel like abandonment. It felt like the quiet acknowledgement of boundaries that should have existed long before any of this began. Work had become the most stable part of my life, not because it distracted me, but because it aligned with the person I had grown into. The structure of my days, the deadlines, the evaluations, the decisions, offered clarity I never found at home. Each task completed, each portfolio I guided, seemed to reinforce a truth I wasn't aware I needed. That consistency built a kind of peace nothing else had ever given me. The final turning point came without warning. One morning, while sorting through routine administrative updates, I noticed a notification attached to an external report. Miranda's name appeared in the listing. She had been formally enrolled in a long-term repayment program. It wasn't a surprise, not after everything that had unfolded, but seeing it documented in the neutral language of a financial system carried a weight that felt definitive. It meant she had reached a point where supportive illusions were no longer available. She was managing her consequences alone. I didn't react outwardly. There was no surge of relief or vindication. Instead, I felt a steady calm, the type that comes when something finally stops demanding your attention. For years, I had been pulled into the undertow of her choices, expected to cushion every fall, to smooth over every reckless leap. But the cycle had broken, and for once, I wasn't the one holding the rope. At home, Mom continued her familiar pattern of soft attempts at reconciliation. Her messages shifted tone, no longer insisting that I help fix things, but suggesting that I stay open or think about family. I read them without anger, but also without obligation. There was no path backward for me. Our dynamic had been shaped by silent expectations, and when I stepped out of that role, the structure fell apart. One evening, she stopped by my place again. I saw her through the peephole, standing with her hands clasped, unsure whether to knock a second time. I didn't open the door, not out of cruelty, but clarity. The life I had built relied on boundaries she wasn't willing to understand. When she finally walked back to her car, her footsteps faded without leaving the ache they once would have. Meanwhile, fragments of Miranda's situation reached me through people who assumed I still wanted updates. They mentioned she had moved into a small rental far from the city center. They said she was working longer hours, picking up shifts she once would have considered beneath her. They spoke about the adjustments she was making, cutting back, reprioritizing, shrinking her lifestyle to match the reality she had ignored for so long. I didn't ask for details. The information came in pieces, drifting in like dust on a breeze. and I let it settle without sweeping it away. Her life was no longer intertwined with mine. The consequences she now faced belonged solely to her, shaped by choices she alone had made. The most unexpected moment came one afternoon when I received a sealed envelope from the bank's administrative division. Inside was a certificate acknowledging my advancement within the institution, a milestone that marked not just progress, but the recognition of years of steady work. Holding that paper, I thought back to the version of myself who once sat at a family dinner table, being told my job wasn't real, that I lacked ambition, that I was merely playing office. The distance between that moment and the present stretched wider than I could have anticipated. It wasn't defined by promotions or titles, but by the internal shift that came when I stopped needing validation from people who never understood what I was building. I placed the certificate in a drawer, not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't need to be displayed. The achievement belonged to me, and that was enough. What this entire journey taught me, and what I hope anyone listening will take with them, is that not every relationship deserves preservation. Some connections survive only because one person keeps patching the holes, pretending the foundation is stronger than it is. And sometimes, the most necessary act of love is the one you direct toward yourself when you walk away. Distance isn't always loss. Sometimes it's freedom. Sometimes it's the first moment you realize your life belongs to you. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If you're watching this right now, tell me, what part of my journey stayed with you the longest?